Hello friends, and welcome to our video lecture on Topic D4.3 Climate Change. Our guiding questions for today: what are the drivers of climate change and what are the impacts of climate change on ecosystems? Our objectives for today: we're going to talk about the greenhouse effect and the enhanced greenhouse effect. We're going to look at some anthropogenic causes, human-made causes of the enhanced greenhouse effect. We're also going to look at some of the positive feedback loops that impact climate change. We're going to look at lots of examples of the consequences of climate change, and then we're going to talk about a few options that we have to try to sequester or hold in some carbon to reduce the speed at which the climate is changing. The greenhouse effect is normal and good. Without it, life wouldn't exist on Earth. Temperatures here would be below 0 degrees Celsius. What happens in the greenhouse effect is this: radiation from the sun travels to Earth in the form of ultraviolet or short wave radiation. Short wave because the wavelengths are short. Some of that UV short wavelength radiation is reflected off of the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere. Ozone up here in the upper layers helps to reflect a lot of that UV radiation. Some of it does make it through the ozone layer, through other layers of the atmosphere, and it hits the surface of the Earth. That radiation is then absorbed by a lot of Earth's surface, warming the surface of the Earth. This is good. Some of that UV radiation is converted from that short wavelength to longer wavelength infrared energy that is then radiated off the surface of the Earth. This is more like heat. So this is heat energy, infrared, longer wavelength radiation. Some of that long wavelength infrared radiation does escape all the way out into space. Earth radiates a lot of that energy into space, but some of it is trapped by our greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane being the two most prevalent, important of our greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases trap, re-radiate this infrared energy, this heat. And so now we get this lovely heat bouncing around in the atmosphere, keeping the Earth nice and warm. The challenge is when we start to increase the concentrations of these greenhouse gases, and then we get what is called the enhanced greenhouse effect, and this is leading to climate change. We are warming up the planet because we have more greenhouse gases being propagated into the atmosphere, causing more of this infrared radiation to be trapped, causing the planet to get warmer. The carbon cycle, seen in this lovely diagram here, helps to maintain the greenhouse effect. We have this beautiful balance between respiration and photosynthesis to help keep good amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have CO2 dissolving into the surface of bodies of water. So again, we've got this great balance until we humans come along. And we have these anthropogenic causes of climate change. Anthro means human. And this idea of generating or producing leads us to this idea of anthropogenic or human-made causes of climate change. How are we humans causing climate change? Lots of ways. So we are increasing the combustion of biomass forests, trees, peat. We are also increasing the combustion of fossil fuels, that incompletely decomposed and fossilized detritus. We also are increasing our release of methane into the atmosphere. Methane is CH4, carbon dioxide, CO2. These are our two most important greenhouse gases. Methane leaks out of landfills. When we throw away leftover food, other organic matter in landfills will decompose, releasing more methane. If you have ever driven by a landfill, you know it's kind of stinky. It's that methane and then lots of other compounds that are also going into the atmosphere. Fossil fuel extraction, when we are mining for oil and natural gas, some of it leaks out into the atmosphere. That's going to increase the amount of methane that we have floating around in the air. And then also the permafrost is no longer permanently frosted. Permafrost was permanently frozen peat. So we had that, again, incompletely decomposed organic matter that in Siberia and parts of northern Canada has been permanently frozen. And so it's this beautiful pool of carbon trapped in the earth because it used to be frozen, but now the permafrost is thawing and methane and carbon dioxide are being released, increasing those concentrations, which is going to lead to more heat trapping. And unfortunately for us, more heat trapping leads to more heat trapping. There are a lot of positive feedback cycles involved in climate change. Remember that positive feedback cycles are those that amplify an effect. The more there is, the more there is. This is bad. So when temperatures increase, what's going to happen is we are going to melt more sea ice. Ice and snow are shiny. They reflect a lot of light. We call that albedo. A lot of sunlight, that solar radiation, is reflected off of the surfaces of the earth that are covered with ice and snow. The less ice and snow there is, the lower the albedo, the less radiation is reflected, the more is absorbed. More energy absorbed means that the temperatures go up. As the temperatures go up, we melt more sea ice, which reduces our albedo, which again means more energy absorption, means that our temperatures go up, and then we have less ice once again. And also an increase in temperature is going to increase the thawing of the permafrost. As the permafrost thaws, as we just said, more methane is released into the atmosphere. More methane means more heat trapping. More heat trapping means an increased temperature, which means that we're going to thaw the permafrost more, which means more methane in the atmosphere. But wait, there's more. If you have ever left a bottle of Dr. Pepper or Diet Coke in your car in the summer, you know that it goes flat because warmer liquids are less able to dissolve gases. So we have this lowered solubility of gases in aqueous or water-based solutions. What does that mean? Well, the oceans actually dissolve a lot of carbon dioxide and oxygen. As the surface of the water gets warmer, it doesn't dissolve the CO2 and the O2 quite as well, which means that CO2 is going to be released into the atmosphere, and more CO2 in the atmosphere means more heat trapping, means a higher temperature, means our water, our lakes and our oceans go more flat. And also, there are more forest fires. The warmer it is, the more likely those forest fires are to occur. And of course, this is the combustion of biomass. The combustion of biomass leads to a release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and more CO2 means warmer temperatures, means more incidences of forest fires, means more CO2, means it's warmer once again. And perhaps the quirkiest thing, we have these super cool chunks of methane, hydrated methane, frozen, sitting on the floors of bodies of water. It's a lovely carbon pool, that methane with its carbon trapped right there in that chunk of ice. But of course, you can guess that as those temperatures increase, these frozen hydrated methane chunks are going to melt. The ice that kind of crusts over the methane is going to melt, releasing the methane gas through the water. Little bubbles of methane will work their way up the water and out into the atmosphere, which is going to increase heat trapping, which means that we're going to melt more methane. And just as there are many causes of climate change, there are also many consequences. We're going to look at several examples, the first of which is deforestation. This map shows ecosystems shifting across the planet. We're going to focus on forest gain and forest loss, especially in this region where we have a lot of our boreal forests and deciduous forests. These forest lands require cold winters. Cold temperatures through a winter are going to reduce the rate of respiration, reduce the rate of decomposition. This is going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is put into the atmosphere. Cold winters also mean more snowfall. More snowfall means wetter land as that snow starts to melt in the spring and summer. That increase in moisture of the soil means that more photolysis and therefore more photosynthesis can occur. The trees are growing better and stronger and bigger. We have an increase in primary production. That means that more carbon dioxide is getting pulled into the trees instead of being released. When climate change occurs, we don't have those cold winters anymore. When we have warmer winters, we have less snowfall, means less moisture through the spring and summer, less moisture is going to lead to an increase in forest fires. Here we can see from the 1980s until the 2020s, we have a general increase in the rate and intensity of forest fires here in the United States. There's a lot of fluctuation. We have years where there's a low incidence of forest fire, but the general trend is definitely upwards. This is problematic because when we're losing forests to forest fires due to climate change, we don't have forests taking in that carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And also, when this biomass burns, we're putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, which is going to make the winters warmer, make the summers drier, and again, increase, due to that positive feedback cycle, the incidence of forest fires, which just makes everything worse and worse. Another consequence of climate change is the melting of landfast ice and sea ice. Landfast ice is literally ice that is fastened to the land. Here we have ice that is locked in a channel. Here we have ice locked in a lagoon. All of this ice is stuck to or fastened to land, hence landfast sea ice. We have this edge where it goes into the flaw lead. We've got a little bit of open water, and then we have pack ice, or these ice flows that kind of mash around, run into each other as they float on the water. We have less now than we did even 30, 40 years ago. So this map is showing us the North Pole. This is showing us the South Pole. This line is the average amount of summertime sea ice that existed between 1981 and 2010. This shaded region is showing us the average amount of ice in the summertime in the last 10 years, 2013 to 2022. There is less. There's also less at the South Pole. Some people argue that this is wonderful. It is beneficial. We have opened up new trade routes between Russia and Greenland, between Canada and Scandinavia. We also have a much easier time drilling for the fossil fuels that are buried at the poles. Less ice. It's easier to drill, easier to mine for minerals. It's good. Unless you're a penguin, in which case it's really tragic. So this is our scientific name for emperor penguins, genus name, species name. Should you want to write about emperor penguins as an example of a consequence to climate change on a quiz or an IB exam, you could remember the scientific name, but you can also use emperor penguin. The common name is fine. Emperor penguins use landfast sea ice for their breeding grounds. This is where they lay their eggs. This is where they raise their hatchlings. This is where these baby penguins, these super cutie patootie little baby penguins, live until they're ready to go jump into the water and live on their own. When the landfast ice breaks off, melts too soon in the spring, these baby penguins are no longer on landfasted ice. Now they're on sea flows drifting out into the ocean. Fewer baby penguins are going to survive as their breeding space declines. This is going to lead to a decrease in the penguin populations, which is going to negatively impact the balance in that ecosystem. We're going to have instability due to that disturbance. Walruses, this is the scientific name for walruses, again, genus and species name. Walruses also rely on landfast ice and the land around the landfasted ice. When walruses swim, they get tired. They use a lot of energy to tire, and so they do these things called hauling outs. So they haul out onto land or onto landfasted ice in order to rest. There's less ice for them to rest upon. They have to spend more time swimming. They spend more time swimming. They need to eat more because the water causes them to lose heat more quickly. And so they need to spend more energy on thermal regulation. But also, if they're eating more, they're going to decrease the population of their food supplies, which means that they're going to have to swim further out into the oceans to get the food that they need, which means that they're expending more energy, which means that they need to eat more again. This is problematic. And also, clearly you can see it's crazy crowded on that chunk of land where those walruses have hauled out. Females with pups will often haul out instead of on land where it's super crowded and lots of big males might trample the babies. They're going to haul out on ice floes instead. The females with their babies rest on ice floes. Less ice flow means fewer places for the babies and the mamas to rest, means less survivability. For those babies means fewer walruses. Another consequence of climate change is the effect on ocean currents. We know that ocean currents are closely tied to weather events. The more energy on the planet, because it's warmer, the more frequent and the more damaging are things like hurricanes. Ocean currents are also related to this idea of upwelling. In upwelling, what happens normally and is good is this. Wind is going to push away water at the surface of the ocean. That loss of water leads to the replacement of the water. The water that is replaced comes from these super deep, nutrient-rich layers of the ocean. It gets pulled up, it rises up, bringing lots of nutrients with it. This is really good because now our surface water has lots of nutrients, so we have an increase in primary productivity, which means we have more algae, we have more plants. More algae, more plants means more photosynthesis. More photosynthesis means more oxygen production, means more food and more oxygen for consumers. All of this drifts out into the open water, and then some of that biomass, all of those nutrients, as the fish die, as algae die, are going to sink down, down, down into those deeper, colder waters that are super rich in nutrients. Those nutrients came from those upper layers. And then what happens is the wind pushes it again, and we have this upwelling, this rising up of nutrients from those colder layers. Those layers are pretty fantastic. So we say that the ocean is stratified. It has these layers. One of the layers, this deeper layer, is more dense, more salty, colder, and also richer in nutrients. Higher up in the ocean, we have less dense, less salty, and warmer water. When climate change warms up the planet, it also warms up this surface of the oceans, which means that the water isn't just warmer, now it's warmer, warmer, which makes it even less dense. And because it's less dense, it's less likely to sink. This increases the stratification of these layers, which makes it harder for upwelling to occur. And also, melting ice is going to add more fresh water to our oceans. Fresh water is less dense than is salty water, which means that our less dense water is even less dense and less salty, and therefore less likely to sink. And also, because the water is warmer, we're going to have less dissolved oxygen. Less dissolved oxygen makes it more difficult for our consumers, especially, to survive. We also see consequences of climate change to terrestrial species. Here we're looking at the shifts in habitats and niches of some temperate montane or mountain-dwelling bird species. In 1985, the range for this particular bird, the common scale-backed antbird, was here at the bottom of the mountain. As temperatures are increasing, this is getting too warm. What used to be the temperature here is now the temperature higher up the altitude of the mountain. And so this bird is moving up. And also this guy, the versicolored barbet, used to live on this part of the mountain, not quite as warm as this, but not as cold as that. But now this temperature range can be found in these higher altitudes, which means that the bird has also moved up. This cutie patootie little guy, the variable antshrike, used to live at the tippy top of the mountain and now doesn't exist on the mountain at all. We say that it has been extirpated, which just means it was kicked out, rooted out, destroyed from this ecosystem because of that principle of competitive exclusion. We cannot keep two species in the same niche. And so as temperatures change and the niches change, some species are lost. This is true not just of altitudes up mountains, but also latitudes up the planet. Here we're looking at the corn belt. We have lots of corn growing here. We expect over this century for the corn belt to shift norther and norther yet. It's going to be really good to be a corn farmer in Canada over the next 100 years or so. We see the same thing happening with soybeans. And so where we have really amazing agricultural lands now, it's not going to be the same kind of agricultural land as these species shift up the planet in latitude. We see this also with trees. The number of tree species from 1971 to 2000 is here, where the darker the blue, the more species we have. Notice that predicted at the end of this century, we have way more species in these northern parts. We're losing a lot of species in the southern parts of North America. And flipping back to our aquatic ecosystems, climate change poses many threats to coral reefs. One way is due to that increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The more CO2 there is in the air, the stronger our concentration gradient is, which means that more carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the water. As we have an increase in the carbon dioxide dissolved in water, some of that carbon dioxide is going to react with the water molecules to form this other compound, carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will dissociate into one hydrogen ion in this bicarbonate ion. Sometimes bicarbonate will further dissociate into another hydrogen ion and carbonate. An increase in these hydrogen ions, these protons, causes an increase in the acidity of the ocean. This is ocean acidification. That increase in acidity comes with that same decrease in pH. This is a problem for coral reefs because much of the skeleton of the reef is built from this compound called calcium carbonate. It is also used by shell-building organisms like clams and oysters and snails. The more hydrogen ions there are in the ocean, the more likely the carbonate is to stick to the hydrogen instead of to the calcium, which means that we're going to have less calcium carbonate, which means that we have less coral reef and weaker shells. And we go from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. But wait, there's more. And also, temperatures have an effect on coral reef health. We learned a few lectures ago, sorry. We learned a few lectures ago that coral has a mutualistic relationship with that super cool algae, zooxanthella. When it's too warm in the water, the corals actually eject their zooxanthella. The zooxanthella is released from their bodies, which means that that mutualistic relationship isn't there anymore, which means that the coral dies. This photo was taken prior to a bleaching event off the coast of a Christmas Island, which is part of Northwest Australia. This was taken prior to a bleaching event. This is the same coral reef after that 2016 bleaching event. You can see a dramatic decrease in the biodiversity and the health of the coral. Climate change definitely poses threats to our coral reefs. Another example of a consequence of climate change is related to this concept of phenology. Phenology is the study of the timing of seasonal biological events, like in these trees. So trees will grow leaves. Sometimes we call this a bud burst in the springtime. And they'll make their flowers and they'll make their fruits. They'll have seeds. Those seeds will germinate according to seasonal conditions. Trees will drop their leaves. Sometimes we call this a bud set when a cap is put at the end of a branch so that it doesn't continue to grow through the winter. Again, these are all seasonal changes. This is the idea of phenology. It also is common in animals. Birds will lay eggs according to seasons. Some animals breed according to seasons. This is all phenology. Sometimes these phenological events are related to photoperiod. The cueing of the event is all about the length of time of the light in each day. So in the winter, we're going to have a shorter photoperiod, short days, less light. In the summer, there's a longer photoperiod. We have longer days, more light. Some cues are photoperiod related, however, others are temperature related. And one of the consequences of climate change is that these will sometimes not match up the way that they used to. An example of one of these mismatches is the relationship between this bird, Paris major, more commonly and awkwardly known as the great tit, and these caterpillars that it catches and eats and also feeds to its babies. The birds have a photoperiod light cued egg-laying behavior. So they'll lay their eggs a little bit now and more. The greatest number of egg laying happens here. A little while later, those eggs are going to start hatching. So we have a few hatchlings, more and more and more, and now we have lots and lots of hatchlings that are growing into fledglings. It used to be timed just right that we would have lots of hatchlings hatching at the same time that we had this big increase in the number of caterpillars emerging, so that the birds had lots and lots of caterpillars to feed their babies. Studies were done. It takes just about 10,000 caterpillars for a family of great tits to feed their whole entire brood from hatching to fledglings. What happened though is because the caterpillar's cue is temperature, it's getting warmer sooner in this season, which means that the caterpillars are emerging earlier than they used to by like a week. But because the birds are photoperiod cued, they're still laying their eggs at the same time, which means that their eggs are still hatching at the same time, which means that when the greatest need for feeding the most birds that have hatched, we've actually gone down in number of caterpillars. The caterpillar number peaked too early to feed all the birds, which means that the numbers of great tits that are surviving is decreasing. In fact, across most of Europe, bud burst, this leafing of trees, happens just about a week earlier now than it did even just 30 years ago. And unfortunately for the birds, their genetically programmed behaviors are not changing as quickly as are these other phenological events. Here are a few more examples of these phenological mismatches. We just looked at the birds, the great tits, and the caterpillars that they ate. This mismatch also affects caribou. They used to migrate across Greenland as the plant matter, the vegetation was emerging as things warmed up. But now that plant matter is emerging faster than the reindeer are migrating, and so they do not have the quality of food that they used to get, which is affecting their calving, the health of their babies. Salmon and grizzlies also have a mismatch. The grizzlies used to sit at the top of rivers as the salmon would migrate. The salmon are now migrating earlier than the grizzlies are going out to catch them. There are also some plant pollinator mismatches. The pollinators are hatching later than the plants are blooming and need that pollination to occur. So once again, lots of disruptions to ecosystems due to these timing mismatches, because some of them are photoperiod cued, others are temperature cued. Some of these phenological changes are actually examples of evolution. Evolution that's a consequence of climate change. These pink salmon, we were just talking about that mismatch with the grizzly bears, they're migrating earlier. They're migrating earlier because of an allele frequency change over time. Evolution is defined as a change in allele frequencies over time, which means that this migration change is an example of evolution. The diamond-shaped alleles are these late migration marker alleles. Remember that alleles are just different forms of a gene. Here we have a decrease in the frequency of those late migration alleles. We're going to have an increase instead of the alternate allele, which leads to earlier migration. This means that evolution is occurring. We've had a change in allele frequencies over time. Less frequency of those later migration alleles is leading to earlier migration. And one last example of a consequence of climate change is we have more bugs. The study was done in Croatia. We are seeing effects also in parts of the world like Alaska. This bug is a spruce bark beetle, and it literally eats spruce trees' barks. Why do we have more bugs? Well, it's because the increase in temperature shortens the life cycle of the bugs. So these particular insects used to have a 2-year life cycle. It took them 2 years to grow up and make babies, and now they can do it in just 1 year. That increase in temperature has shortened their life cycle, which means that instead of babies every 2 years, now we get an exponential rise in populations every year, twice as many generations in the same amount of time. Increased numbers of bugs due to increased numbers of generations is going to lead to an expansion of their geographic range. As temperatures change, new niches and habitats are made available to the bugs. More bugs means more spreading of diseases. As winters get warmer, more bugs can survive those colder winters. Sometimes the predators are not going to have the match with the prey because of phenological changes. And then same idea, sometimes we'll have a loss of synchrony with that host plant. Again, another phenological mismatch. One of the problems of this increase in bark beetle in these spruce trees, clearly the beetles are eating the trees, but then also woodpeckers come along to eat the beetles, and now the woodpeckers are also destroying the trees. More beetles means that the trees are weakened. Also, climate change makes less water available to the trees through the summers, which makes them less resilient, which means that the beetles have an easier time eating them. There is some hope, though, for us to slow down climate change and try to reduce some of the consequences, and we can do this through carbon sequestration. The idea of sequestering something is that we hide it away. So here in carbon sequestration, what we're trying to do is to capture and then store carbon in ecosystems. One way that we can do this is through afforestation. This prefix af means onto. So we're literally trying to put forests onto places where there were not forests before. That's what this image is. This is a region of Israel where afforestation is occurring. Trees are being planted to try to initiate the growth of a forest where there was not a forest. Forest regeneration or reforestation is another way that we can try to sequester some carbon on the planet. This happens naturally after wildfires. So a fire destroyed a lot of trees here, but the trees that survived the fire let go of seeds, and those seeds are growing into baby trees. So reforestation can occur naturally. We humans can also lead some reforestation drives. Unfortunately, in industry, that usually means a monoculture. Remember that monocultures when we plant a lot of the same kind of crop over a very large area. So when we cut down trees to make paper, we often will plant trees, the same kind of tree that we want to use to make more paper. So there's not the great diversity that we would love to have, but at least there's some carbon intake. A final way that we can sequester some carbon is to restore wetlands. So here we're looking at in Indonesia restoring wetlands so that we have more peat being formed. And again, that peat, that incomplete decomposition of organic matter due to waterlogged acidic environments, that incomplete decomposition of organic material means that a lot of carbon gets stuck under that water and is stored there or sequestered there for a long amount of time. And on that note, my friends, we have finally gotten to the end of our video lecture on the depressing topic of climate change. Hopefully you are feeling confident about your ability to answer guiding questions, the drivers of climate change, that's going to be us humans, and what are the impacts of climate change on ecosystems. Those were our consequences, all those examples that we talked about. We also explained the greenhouse effect versus the enhanced greenhouse effect, the anthropogenic causes of the enhanced greenhouse effect, us humans. We talked about those positive feedback loops. As the earth gets warmer, it makes the earth get warmer. All those consequences one more time. And then we do have some hope we can sequester or store carbon away with these afforestation, reforestation, and wetland restoration efforts. Great work, my friends, today, and I look forward to how you are going to save this planet of ours.